Sense. I think we're live. Good morning, everybody. So I unimaginatively called this talk Three Priorities for a Public Health Research Agenda.
Reset the timer, please.
Because Dr. Leshner asks for three priorities for a public health research agenda, and I'm a task-oriented guy, so this is what I'm going to talk about. But a bit of background. I think what brings us together is the Newtown massacre. And that of course, triggered an extraordinary national conversation about guns, about gun violence, and about the regulation of guns, gun policy. And I think one of the things that was revealed by that conversation is that there are very serious deficits in our knowledge and the kind of information that might be wanted to craft evidence-based policy in this area. So that's what I'd like to react to is talk to about some of the lessons of Newtown in that respect. What was it about that conversation? What did we learn from that? And one of the things was that we, in my mind, need an updated survey of gun ownership. I think this is an idea that you'll hear from other people as well. The second would be that we really need to do an evaluation of the state laws that require background checks for private sales. And the third is it would, I think, be timely to do an updated analysis of school rampage shootings of the sort that peaked in the late 1990s. Now, as a bonus suggestion, I think it would be very valuable and also relevant to Newtown to look at the sources of guns to youth suicides, but I'm not going to develop that since that would exceed my budget as described by Dr. Leshner. I'm sure it will come up in other discussions this afternoon. Okay, so let me start by talking about the updated survey of gun ownership. And what would be provided about a in-depth survey of how many guns there are, who owns them, how they were acquired, how are they used, how are they stored, who has access to them within the family, and so forth. That all of this seems to me to be the kind of baseline information that would be valuable for any kind of population-based inquiry in this area. And the information that we have from this is woefully out of date. And in fact, there was a 1994 survey and then another one in 2004. It's now 10 more years since we've had anything like this. One small example is illustrated by this quote from the president who says, "Why wouldn't we want to close the loophole that allows as many as 40% of all gun purchases to take place without a background check?" This 40% figure was repeated over and over again during the debate. It was also widely critiqued. The fact checkers, PolitiFact, the Washington Post were on it. And I was answering a lot of phone calls, partly because it came from some research that I did with Jens Ludwig based on the 1994 National Survey of Private Ownership of Firearms in the US. And of course, the reporters just couldn't believe that what we were hearing about was a statistic that was 20 years out of date along the way, but the fact was that's what was available. It was also somewhat misquoted, it should be said, but that's another story. But let me tell you about that survey and then about the one that was conducted by David Hemingway, Matt Miller, and others in 2004. Just a little bit. The 1994 survey was sponsored by the National Institute of Justice. I'm delighted to see Lois Mock here, who I think was the project officer for that. And the grant was to the Police Foundation, and then Jens and I later evaluated it. And the Joyce Foundation, the second one was privately sponsored by the Joyce Foundation to Harvard. And you can see the samples were of similar size and quite large. The response rates were woeful and very, very low indeed, using the random digit dial method. And so the response rate is maybe the first thing to notice about this. It says that this is not a slam dunk necessarily as a recommendation and something that we should consider very carefully. Let me give you a few more statistics that put the two surveys side by side. Very stable in terms of the 25% of adults in both cases owning guns. It turns out that there were also estimates about the percentage of households with guns that came out of that in other surveys, but they're unreliable because if you ask somebody who's not themselves a gun owner whether there's a gun in the house, they're likely to understate what's going on. So you really need to talk to the owners themselves. Maybe the thing that would be most surprising if you're not familiar with this kind of research is the number of guns per owner, which in 1994 was 4.4 and had gone up to 6.6 is the best estimate that came out of the Harvard survey, which parallels with the fact that almost half of owners had 4 or more guns, according to that survey. And then the percent of owners that had at least one handgun is parallel. All right, so this gives you kind of a taste of the information, but it also gives you another illustration of the great difficulty of doing a good job, particularly in estimating, for example, the number of guns in circulation. So Richard Feldman said, well, it's over 300 million. To actually estimate the number of guns in private hands requires that you take account of the fact that there's a long right tail to this ownership distribution, and that the number of guns you estimate in the US is going to be heavily influenced by the number of people who say they have 50 guns in their home. And that turns out to be a small fraction, but they are very influential in terms of the total and trying to understand what's going on, which means it's very difficult to estimate that. The other thing that you might notice if you do the math is this increase of 50% about the number of guns per owner during this period, which it would be impossible as a net increase in terms of the total, just based on net additions from imports and manufacturers during this period. It represents well over 100 million guns. There weren't that many coming in. So this is an unstable kind of estimate that comes out of this and something you need to worry about. So we say, well, what can we learn from a survey like this? And I think we have a better chance of learning about transactions and about storage habits and about carrying, for example, that we might be able to paint the picture on those kinds of things. And that would be very helpful in terms of a number of the questions about who's at risk and what kind of interventions might be useful in this area. But I think we have to come back to this question about, is this really a worthwhile exercise given the current political sensitivity of these issues? Can we do a survey like this that is of high quality? It's worse than useless if we do it and we get the wrong answers and misrepresent what's really going on. So I would suggest that the CDC do a preliminary study about the feasibility of doing a high quality study of this kind. All right, well, the second issue that I wanted to talk about is the evaluation of private sale background checks. Of course, we never have had that in the US at the federal level, but it was the most prominent of the president's proposals, and the great frustration for us analysts was that there was very little to be said about what effect. Now, I noticed Richard Feldman had already done the evaluation and found out 0 to negligible effect, but that is not exactly empirical, I would say. And, you know, there is a possibility of being empirical in this area because we have 15 states that have background check requirements for private sales, at least of handguns. 5 of those states also require it for the long guns, and this according to a recent review by Wintemute and Baker. So I think that that's an area that seems possible that we could do an evaluation, and certainly it would be of great interest given the prominence of this proposal. We do have some evidence that background checks have affected trafficking for guns, but there really have been no good evaluations of the effect on crime and suicide. So once again, I would say that this is a case that it seems like we have the demand for this kind of study. We would really like to know this answer. The question is, can we supply a good answer? Is there a design, an evaluation design that would be reliable in this case? I took a look at the 1991 California universal background check and found that in that case, it would have been quite difficult to do a good evaluation, you know, starting with the fact that that wasn't the only law that changed in 1991 in California. They also changed the list of disqualified people. And furthermore, 1991, if you know the history of violence in this country, was a tumultuous, you know, it was a turning point. It was a year that we went from a peak homicide rate and started down the other side, but not all the states turned at the same time, and it's very hard to figure out what the right control group is for California under those circumstances. So again, what I would say to CDC is don't simply say we're going to do this, but to be very careful about how to proceed in this area in terms of getting a design that would give reliable results. Okay, and finally, maybe a more surprising recommendation is to revisit the school rampage shootings. You know, we had that epidemic that ended in Columbine, and the U.S. Secret Service did their study of the Safe School Initiative. The National Research Council, under Mark Moore's leadership, did a report called Deadly Lessons. But since then, it's been largely neglected because we haven't had a lot of these school rampage shootings. It is epidemic, though. It is the kind of thing that we can't count on not having another one of these. And it seems to me it would be very helpful to take the advice of the Secret Service in their report and develop our capacity for threat assessment and prevention in this area. The remarkable fact about those old studies was that the adolescents involved signaled in most cases that they were going to do something. And so the ability to use social media these days and other sources to be able to determine what could be done to understand when plots fail and when they don't fail and how we can have schools prevent that all seem very important. So I see the mime is about to come onto the stage. Let me just say then that these are my three recommendations, each one of which hedged a bit because I think that we have to be very careful that if we're going to take on these topics, we do it well. Thanks very much.
Good. Thank you very much. So far, the speakers have followed instructions, and they're actually telling us things we should think about to focus upon. Daniel Gross from the Brady campaign.